We do not hear you.
Hello and welcome to the 13th conversation in the In Conversation series of CRIS, the Consortium for Research on Innovation Studies. I am Rajesh, one of the founders of the CRIS network and its organizing secretary. I moderate this session. The CRIS network was founded during 2021 by a few early career innovation scholars, mostly alumni of GlobalX events. We started with a lecture series on the theoretical foundations of innovation systems and called it Chris Freeman Centenary Lecture Series, as it coincided with the birth centenary year of Christopher Freeman. Subsequently, we started this series titled In Conversation. The In Conversation series portrays prominent innovation scholars of the day in the form of intellectual biographical interviews. Today, in the 13th event, Francisco Louzãं will be interviewed by Maria Enrica Virgilito. We have a distinguished panel of 3 discussants: Mario Simoli, Luigi Marengo, and Valeria Cirillo. This program will last for 2 hours. Marica will introduce Francisco and interview him for 1 hour. By the way, you can read Francisco's autobiographical essay on our website, which is a very readable and interesting piece exclusively written for this purpose. After their conversation, we take a break of 5 minutes, and then the 3 panelists will share their experience with Francisco and ask their questions. After Francisco's response, the session will open for general discussion for about 15 to 20 minutes. All participants are requested to type in their well-framed questions in the chat so that we can pick them up and pass on to Marica and Francisco. Now, I take the pleasure of introducing the interviewer. Maria Enrica Virgilito is Associate Professor in Economics, Scuola Superiore Sant'Anna, Italy. She holds a PhD in economics from the Sant'Anna School of Advanced Studies and started career as an assistant professor at the Catholic University of the Sacred Heart in Milan. She is Global Labor Organization Fellow and holds editorial positions in important journals such as Industrial and Corporate Change, Structural Change and Economic Dynamics, Evolutionary Political Economy, etc. Marica has served as a consultant to World Bank, JRC, and several other important international organizations. Now, over to you, Marica. Thank you very much.
So first of all, let me thank you, Rajesh, for the organization of this meeting, and let me thank you, Francisco, for, let's say, having me elicited as an interviewer. And it's really a pleasure for me to share these 2 hours of conversation today together. First of all, because I believe that the intellectual inheritance of CRIS has to be, let's say, keep very vivid and transmitted to young scholars and, let's say, new generation upcoming. And this is particularly important in a phase in which economics as a discipline is, let's say, under threat in many respects in terms of, let's say, its statutory role as an intellectual discipline, its political role, its social role. So I believe that, let's say, personality and figures like the one of CRIS are the forms of, let's say, inspirational route that together, as evolutionary economists today, we should try to, let's say, embrace. And interviewing Francisco today, for me, it's really a great pleasure. First of all, because I have personal, I have, let's say, the possibility to know him in person. I spent some time in Lisbon visiting him before COVID. We had very important and interesting intellectual exchange. So it's really an opportunity to, let's say, share together some of the discussion we have been having. And the second point that I want to highlight is that Francisco is today what really represents an intellectual. So we are having a problem of, let's say, lack of intellectual position of scholars. Many of us are really strict into our, let's say, publishing activity, administrative activity, let's say, day by day, minute work. And it's normal. But I think we still need, and we need today in a very, let's say, pressuring, we need today in a very pressuring way to take larger institutional consideration, political attitudes, and capacity to bring together, if you want, intellectual ability, cognitive ability, social ability, and political capacity to influence political discourse. And Francisco is a person that actually was able to do that throughout his own life. You will see during our interview that his biographical experience is really, if you want, intertwined between intellectual discourse and political events from really the beginning of his approach to economics. And the way in which he met Chris was for him the possibility to investigate some questions, some research ideas that maybe he couldn't be in the, let's say, in the best opportunity to develop in Portugal. And this is also something that I believe Francisco will share with us, why he decided to visit Greece and why he decided to develop his PhD thesis with him. But the theme of the PhD thesis, the way in which Francisco, together with Chris, approached the problem of long waves and the problem of techno-economic paradigm, and the way in which macroeconomic systems are influenced by technological condition. The leading piece, as time goes by, published in 2001 by Oxford, still represent one of the major theoretical contributions that the evolutionary approach has produced nowadays. I teach this book, not the whole book. I teach part of the book. It's always a pleasure. It's always a discovery. And if you want to represent also an eclectic and an heterodox approach inside evolutionary economists, in the sense that many of the contribution of evolutionary economists at that time were really much focusing on firm, on industry, on innovation. But Francisco had the capacity to twist all of them and to put into a macroeconomic perspective and to put it into the analysis of capitalism. So if you just look at the many times the word capitalism has been written by evolutionary scholars, this is not very much common. We've been talking about socioeconomic system, socioeconomic fabric, but I think we were somewhat afraid of talking about capitalism. Actually, Francisco did exactly this. By means of political economy analysis, he was really able to, and is still able to, let's say, discussing about capitalism from an evolutionary perspective and understanding what is the political economy of capitalism today. So its measured contribution since 2001 have been moving a lot. I remember the fantastic piece in which he approaches econometrics and the studies of the pendulum vis-a-vis the contribution of Frisch, but nowadays he's moving into new realms of analysis. He's studying a lot networks, system, banking system, the relationship between influence, power, and the unfolding of crisis. So if you want, the political economy of the actors of capitalism. And this is really the way in which he also evolved his intellectual production, is a clear if you want, mark, is a clear footprint of the importance that he gave throughout his career to, let's say, understanding political economy from a good perspective, if you want, or from, let's say, a non-neutral, a non-mainstream perspective. Having said that, I believe I put, let's say, some of the pieces. Some of them are still not discovered, and during our conversation, I'm sure that Francisco will have the chance to share with us his thought. And I want also to leave, let's say, let's say, the presentation of some of his biographical piece related to the political participation into the parliament that he has undertaken in the last 10-15 years, how this has been relevant for him and how he was able to reconcile, if you want, a double role, or do we need to have double role or not? This is also something that I think we can discuss together. So this was, if you want, my reading of his biographical note, and I hope it is a good appetizer. And if I'm right, Rajesh, now I can start interviewing him with very specific questions, right?
Sure. Please,
Great.
please go ahead.
That's great. So, Francisco, I would like, if you agree, I would like to ask you, which was your first approach with economics during your life, and why did you decide to take the route of studying this discipline?
Well, let me just begin with a couple of words, thanking Rajesh for his initiative and for the CRISIS network, which is a wonderful set of conferences going on, for Marica for two generous presentation, as well as Luigi, Valeria, and Mario, who will intervene later in the session, just to hug a couple of friends who are over there, Carlotta, Bendoca, Gerald, other people. Very happy to be together with you now. How did I begin in economics? Well, as my short biographical note indicates, and sorry for a couple of mistakes, which I did, more than a couple of mistakes, which I found rereading it in the morning. My youth was, I lived in Portugal, mostly in Portugal, under the oldest dictatorship in Europe. So it was 30 years after the end of the Second World War. It was not expected that the dictatorships would prevail, but yet they did in Portugal and in Spain. And in Portugal, it was even older than in Spain. And so that was my youth. So censorship, colonial war, all that was the day-to-day of young people, well, believing that they should change the world in that time. So my reason to choose economics, some of my closest friends chose history, but I was rather mad at them, and we discussed, because I believe that economics would provide a better understanding of the dynamics of the real life in society. So the real forces, the real power, the real capacity of understanding. I must tell you also a small anecdote. Well, Portugal is a small country, it's 10 million people. It was even smaller at that time, and people attending high school and university were not so many. My mother has been one of the first female lawyers in Portugal, and she was one of her professors, became later on the successor of Salazar as the head of the dictatorship. Marcelo Caetano was his name. And I met him once at a social event. So that was 3 or 4 years before the fall of the dictatorship. So I would be 14, something like that. And he asked me, what would I study? What are you willing to study? Will you do? And I told him that I would study economics. And he was very unhappy, replying that economics was the school of the communists. that was a very happy moment, because understanding that the dictator himself was afraid of public school, of the university of the country itself, and that economics would provide some means to understand what was going on, what was good confirmation for my choice. So I went to economics. I studied economics, although when I entered the university, it was closed by the same dictator. The classes were suspended. There was a lot of students' movement against the dictatorship, and mostly against the participation in the colonial war. They decided simply to close some of the faculty. So I had no classes in my first year, and then there was the fall of the dictatorship in April '74. You all know about it. And of course, during the next months and years, Portugal changed quite a lot. Free parliament was elected, censorship was abolished, political parties were authorized, new newspapers were created, and a new epoch of democracy began.
Thank you, Francisco. And I mean, when you approached economics, let's say after the first year of closure of the university, which were the school of thought that were most influential for you? Which were, let's say, the authors that you consider important during your bachelor?
Well, when I was reading on economics before entering the university, and then in the years afterwards, I followed mostly Marxist economists. I had personal contact and some cooperation with Ernest Mandel, a Belgian Marxist economist, who wrote a wonderful book on the third Sparta Capitalismus. The third, in French it was translated the third age of capitalism, and in English as the late capitalism. Frederick Jameson, the art critic, reused the concept, which comes from the Frankfurt School, indeed, later on. With him, I had my first contact with the Kondratiev concept of long waves. So it provided a general map for understanding capitalism. It was much later that I read Keynes, with a big surprise, I must say, not only because the way of writing, which is not the less of the qualities of Keynes, but because of his whole approach, which was so influential and so surprising in the 1930s and later on, of course. And because as well of his connection to political economy and political decision during the Second World War, the debates on Bretton Woods and the New World Order, which we will perhaps take later on the question of development, and because of his understanding of economics in the exact sense that evolutionary economists tended to do afterwards, as the study of process of change, of coordination, of adaptation, of the dynamics. That was his contribution. I must tell you, Marika, that I read Schumpeter later on. Mostly when I was preparing my master's dissertation, I went for a couple of weeks to Sussex to know Chris Freeman, and I spent these two weeks with him, very impressed by the Sprue environment, by the people there, historians, economists studying firms, the interest of the innovation studies, the quality of the center of research, I found the same interest, but a new protagonist, who was Schumpeter. Schumpeter was, of course, a very strange fellow. He was, as Keynes, contrary to Keynes, he considered himself a neoclassical economist. And Keynes, of course, was strongly opposed to neoclassical economists and defied them and vanquished them in that first half of the 20th century. But at the exact same time, because they were born the same year, they had parallel careers and opposed ones, because Schumpeter hated Keynes. Schumpeter considered himself a neoclassical economist, but he was a very unorthodox orthodox economist. So discovering his double standing, well, you know that is the most important economists for Schumpeter were Marx and Walras. So two opposed characters in the history of economics, but all this double standing, the curiosity he had, the interest he had precisely on dynamics, what makes him also an evolutionary economist, that I knew when I read Schumpeter under the influence of Chris Freeman. Of course, Chris Freeman was, he could be called a neo-Schumpeterian, and that's fair. But he would be very free and he was very influenced by Marx, by Keynes. He was very open-minded, as we know, and all the fascination of Chris Freeman is certainly his capacity of curiosity, his capacity of learning, of understanding, of looking for new perspectives, of combining these views in his whole work, and that was fascinating. So that was my contact with my first contact with Chris Freeman. Then he was my PhD supervisor, and finally we wrote as time goes by.
So that's great. So I mean, it's very much clear how you start from Marxian studies, then you end up in, let's say, Keynesian studies, then you move to Schumpeterian studies, and then Chris arrived. And you also mentioned the curiosity and its intellectual capacity to not be, let's say, attached to just one specific school of thought. So this hybridism that he has always shown. So if you can, let's say, share with us which were, let's say, the most relevant contribution and areas of investigation that you would like to, let's say, mention that derives from, let's say, specifically the influence of Chris. So where Chris has been, if you want, really much influential in your work. You already mentioned as times goes by, but I think there is also a lot of his influence in your article about the pendulum and all the influence of, let's say, between equilibrium and disruptive change. So if you would like to share with us the most powerful contribution for you that reveal, let's say, Chris' influence.
Well, as most of the participants in this discussion and those attending know quite well, so it's not necessary to emphasize, Chris was interested by a whole range of topics in economics. He concentrated his work, his most well-known work, on innovation, and that's the epicenter of the SPRU and of all the intellectual project of SPRU. But that could combine historical, what we today call microeconomics and macroeconomics, and all that would be present in Chris's work. He wrote with Luc Soter his book on full employment. A lot of his work on long waves was together, and by the way, influenced by an original idea by Carlota Perez, who contributed crucially to organize the map presented by their common work and by Chris Freeman with me in as time goes by, of the mismatch between the techno-economic paradigm, a concept which, by the way, was also developed previously by Giovanni Dozzi, and the mismatch between this techno-economic paradigm and the social institutional framework. This is very powerful. And I believe that this provides the means to understand the long periods in the history of economics, in the history of the economic dynamics. So that was my first work with Chris. When I was doing that, I prepared more or less at the same time, because the book was published in 2000 and then republished in 2001, and then later on. I was preparing my paper on the oscillations and economic oscillations, which was the intriguing pendulum. That came out from the discussion on mathematical formulations, different, and by the way, the metaphorical descriptions of the pendulum or the rocking horse, as Ragnar Frisch proposed, and other people, the pendulum, well, Alfred Marshall, John Robinson, a lot of different people use the same metaphor. And I looked at the mathematical formulations which could be used to understand this sort of description of reality. And of course, try to compare it with the real historical evolution. That's how the paper came out. From that point of view comes my reading, which is arguable, of course, my reading of the limits of econometrics and the hidden history of econometrics. You know, when I was preparing my PhD and then writing the book with Chris, some of the chapters discuss the contributions of Keynes, of Schumpeter, of Ragnar Frisch, and the econometricians for the study of historical processes in economics. And so I went to Oslo to read the personal archives of Ragnar Frisch. Then I went to Harvard to read the personal archives of Schumpeter, which, by the way, are much more difficult to read because Schumpeter had this boring tendency to destroy or to reuse all the personal letters, to take some notes and then to destroy them. So there's a lot of there are a lot of boxes of fragments in the Schumpeter archive, and we don't have the neat history of correspondence as we have with Ragnar Frisch. So, but you see, there I was with the archives, with the writings of the creator of econometrics, the first Nobel Prize in economics, later in 1969, together with Jan Tinbergen, another econometrician whom I studied in Rotterdam. So looking at what they were doing, I understood that econometrics was not to be what it became later on. That's the reason why Ragnar Frisch and Jan Tinbergen were so unhappy about the future developments of econometrics. And then indeed, after the mid-40s, 1940s, they abandoned the field and they devoted their efforts to decision-making, to planning, to democratic issues in economic choice, and criticized their colleagues in very, very strong polemics. From that, I wrote a book, The Years of High Econometrics, which is a study of this generation and of these lost bifurcations in the history of econometrics. That's still Chris followed, because the book was published in 2007. My later interest in finance and in the regime of financial accumulation is a later work, and Frisch was not anymore to to help or to guide or to give advice at that time. But in a sense, all this comes out from the interest on real economics of real processes, of real life, trying to avoid too much abstraction or the trap of general equilibrium or other descriptions of nature, which presume that there is no life in nature, that there is no change, there are no strategies, no conflicts, no choices, no options, and indeed that we are all dead.
So I think this is a perfect, let's say, statement to start, if you want, the second part of our interview. So moving from the inheritance of Greece from today's challenges. So you put together the pieces that were more influential in framing the most relevant contribution. You talk about techno-economic paradigms and matching or mismatching in terms of socio-economic system. You also shared with us the importance of understanding econometrics as a means not only to define, if you want, convergence to equilibrium, but also to tackle changes and the problem of patterns of changes and coordination. Now, we are in a phase of complete mismatch, in a phase of, I would say, I mean, scholars have been talking about intertwining crises, multiple crises. The system is clearly showing a lot of, let's say, discrepancies, a lot of weaknesses, but it keeps working somehow in a good or in a bad perspective. I mean, in a good way for those who are gaining, maybe, and in a bad way for those who are losing. What can we inherit today from, let's say, the approach that you have been developed so far, the influence of Greece, and in general of evolutionary economics as a school of thought in order to face these intertwined crises? And I just mentioned the social crisis in terms of inequality and exploding asymmetries. I would mention the political crisis in terms of weaknesses of democratic system, but what now is becoming more and more severe is clearly the climate change crisis and environmental crisis, in a phase in which we see that, I mean, as humanity, we've been providing so much bad externalities that the system is somehow getting back into, or in any case, undertaking new path, new tips, new direction. And in that, I'm sure that this integrated approach that you have been developing with the notion of techno-economic paradigm and socio-economic system is very much powerful. So could you share with us how and which are the tools that we can mobilize in this phase from one end, and which are also the areas of investigation that for you are relevant? So where we should look, what we should look for?
Well, that's a very general and difficult question, and maybe you will contribute with some comments. I hope so, Marika, because I know your work, and which is a brilliant work, and I'm certain Luigi, Valeria, and Mario will take again some of these points. So let me just give you a couple of indications of what I did, which are my concerns. I worked in two different fields which are related to the mismatch, let's say, between the techno-economic paradigm and the social institutional framework. One was trying to measure outside the tools, the traditional tools of econometrics, which both, if they presume that the nature can be described by a system of simultaneous equations leading to an equilibrium point or to some equilibria, or even if they accept some sort of dynamics in an equilibrium path, would not be able to provide. So I explored different ways. I wrote with some colleagues a number of papers on the mathematics of dynamics in financial markets, mostly for mathematical journals or for Physica, using topological, geometrical tools on dynamic processes. But of course, the second approach has been more relevant, and it will be more relevant, I believe. It's to understand the historical process of the mismatch, the double crisis you mentioned. In that sense, Chris was confronted in different periods of his life with different forms of approaching the problem. At the beginning of the spool, almost at the beginning of the spool, you know that that spool was very important and very involved in the debate on the limits of growth. On the report by the Club of Rome, of the Meadows. When we reread that debate, it is paradoxical, because the Meadows were arguing at the beginning of the 70s, I believe that the book was published in 72, that there would be an exhaustion of the possibilities of reproducing the energy system. They would mention that in 75, oil would finish, and that pollution would prevent the capacity of the industrial development in the future. And Chris fought with his colleagues, fought those ideas. History proved he was right, and he was right for the right reasons. Because today, well, I read some later comments saying, why did a so bright economist miss the point of ecology in the 70s? He did not. He understood that technology could change the conditions of could create a new paradigm, a new techno-economic paradigm, and it did. There was no exhaustion of oil. There will be, but not in 1975. There will be new forms of energy production, older and newer, including the worse alternatives. But that will go on, because capitalism is a system which is powerfully adaptive. It is able to adapt, and it changes itself. That was the intuition by Schumpeter, and he was right on that. That's why he contradicted all the neoclassical economists, saying that innovation came from inside the system, not from outside. And that was one of his most important points, and it is a right one. So Chris took it again, and but he understood that the choices were open, and the social institutional framework which would be described could move in alternative ways. He was very optimistic. For all his life, he was very optimistic. And I think that's beautiful from the Chris generation. Chris fought in the Second World War, was in the army in the Second World War. So understanding that after the disaster, the world disaster, the Second World War, that things could be changed, the society could be opened, innovation could rule, new industrial possibilities, that the availability of means of living could be spread over the world. That was very important. But he understood, and he wrote about the difficulties ahead. There's a beautiful book by Chris, The Economics of Hope, which puts together some of his chapters and some of his essays on the topic. So I mentioned already his discussion on full employment. I think that's one of the most powerful concepts coming out from Keynesian economics, and that's a program for work, for life, for respect, for solving the conundrum of the social institutional framework paralysis. And I think that's the dimensions which should be explored and which should be discussed, coming out from his influence and from what we learned from him. In that sense, I believe that there is a part of Chris's work which is less developed, which has been less developed by his students than the core of innovation, studies of geography of firms, industrial regions, and even national systems of innovation, which is a so important concept when Bent Hocker developed, and if he did not invent it, and others did as well. Mario Cimoli, of course, wrote worked quite a lot about it in the sense of development. But that part of the Chris's work, which has not been so much development, is macroeconomics. And I believe that's very important. And I believe that that's the missing link in evolutionary economics. You mentioned, Marika, that a lot of evolutionary economists discuss firms, write about firms, and they do some of the best work on the understanding of the nature of the institution of firms. Well, compare it to the new institutionalist economists, and you see the difference. That's wonderful work. And but adding the understanding of capitalism as a whole, of the extractive system, of the rentist nature of finance, of what that sort of power represents, that's political economy, or macroeconomics, which is two different names for the same thing. But and that's required, that's necessary. And I noticed once, I quoted in a biographical an essay on Chris's contribution to macroeconomics. Once he was interviewed by a colleague, and he asked him, what should be the agenda of economics? Well, precisely what you asked me. So let me give you the reply by Chris, which is much better than what I could do. He said, I don't think you will change the main paradigm of neoclassical economics. I think you have to attack it head on in the center. Most of the people working on innovation systems prefer to work at the micro level. They are a bit frightened still of the strength of the neoclassical paradigm at the macroeconomic level. But I think that's where they have to work. So we have the agenda. You have to have an attack on the central core of macroeconomic theory. It is happening, but it is not happening enough. That's what he wrote, some years, a couple of years before dying. And he was quite right. So in order to have a general global view, conceptual core, the understanding of dynamics at the micro and at the macro level, meaning economics is about power, is the study of power, is required.
Well, I think the agenda is very promising, and we have a lot to do because it's really where I think we should put effort and, let's say, understanding of what is going on. So many thanks, Francisco, for your deep consideration and for being so clear and so effective, actually, in defining both the position of Chris vis-à-vis the debate on the environmental crisis and his capacity to foresee at that time path and trends that nowadays we are seeing, stressing the role of adaptation of the capitalist system. So this dynamic nature of capitalism and this capacity of the system to keep changing, but also the, let's say, the political structure and the power relation dimension of capitalism, because capitalism actually is about power relation, and I think this will be even further developed in the second round of discussion. Let me, let's say, flag the very last 2 points of this first part. The first question I would like to ask you to conclude the second, let's say, the final phase of this interview is about policy, in the sense that, I mean, discussing about policy is now becoming even a sort of buzzword. Everyone, when we write paper, the reviewers always ask us, oh, which is the policy implication? Or how can you, let's say, sell your piece of research for, I don't know, policy guidelines? But here Mario clearly will follow up more properly. I would like to ask you, which is, let's say, the relationship that you perceive in terms of bringing analytical understanding of capitalism, as you pointed out so far, and, let's say, policy guidelines. Where should we enter? In which type of realms do you think it's more urgent to propose policy suggestions?
Well, if you all have noticed, Bent Oke wrote in the chat some lines of contribution telling, perhaps he will come back later on, that he asked once Chris, who was the economist who influenced him most, and he pointed to Keynes, not to Schumpeter. He pointed to Keynes, and Bent Oke's interpretation, that's quite fair, I think, is that that was because of his view on fighting unemployment and fighting for full employment, a concept which was so important in the first decades of the century and after the Second World War, and which became taboo afterwards. This is not anymore conceived, and it should be understood well. In all what that means, it means employment, dignity, wage, autonomy, respect, labor relations, democracy in the place of work, open discussions in society on the rules of innovation and social change. So I believe that's one of the ways to tackle the question of policy making. Of course, when I was for a dozen of years in Parliament, I was there when we finished I was a member of Parliament when we finished the Oxford book, As Time Goes By, and as well I was there as well when I wrote the book on the history of econometrics. So in that period, my practical concern was mostly on budget issues and on tax systems. Of course, that combines quite well with the lately revived discussions on inequality. Of course, it was not Piketty who invented the discussion on inequality. It is a long British economics tradition from Atkinson and other people. Well, it goes back to Marx and to many other people, but it took a lot of space, and that's very good news for economics that it was so much discussed in the last 10 years since the publication of Piketty's book in 2013. So in that sense, my experience of discussions on tax systems was very close to that discussion on inequality. That's one of the most powerful tools. Well, what would be the balance between taxes on wealth, on the progressive taxes on income? Should capital and labor be taxed with different criteria, as they are indeed, and strongly so in many of the developed economies of the world? What should be the choices of investment in infrastructure, leading directly to innovation, to social innovation, which is as important as technological innovation per se? the choices of common goods, of the cost and the prices, or the availability of common goods, the discussion on the tendency to privatize natural monopolies in order to get larger rents for financial capital. All that, all those are relevant fights or relevant conflicts in the space of social and political or political economy decision and the social life. I believe that all that was present in the agenda on fighting inequality before even Piketty gave his contribution, which is important and also confused as I believe in some point, but nevertheless an important contribution to the public discussion and the public interest on the topic. Anyway, we have been discussing since the peak of inequality in 2007 and 2008. And the financial crisis around that period, where there have been going on discussions on what should be the strategies in economics. And I believe that evolutionary economists could contribute in that sense, precisely combining all the best intuitions and the best experiences of the 20th century and the 21st century discussions on how to redefine the social institutional framework.
Thank you, Francisco. Thank you for highlighting the path in, let's say, in the policy direction, the priority in your perspective, and also the coherence, because actually this interview, I think, is very much coherent. I mean, you show a lot of, I mean, a capacity to understand from, if you want, from a normative and from a positive perspective, what the neoclassical always say, the system. So I think it's very much, we are going very much into a discourse that actually will ask for, I mean, the final question that I have, and I think it's very much consequential vis-a-vis what you said so far, is the building of the paradigm, in the sense that we've been, so we started from your biographical notes, and we discussed how you entered into economics. Then we discussed together the role of Chris in producing your thought. Then we end up in studying, let's say, in discussing about research. Then we move into policy. And then I would like you to, let's say, share with us your perspective in terms of intellectual and as a scholar. So how should we put forward this discourse, this concept, this way of approaching the discipline, and which is the relevance, the balance that we should, let's say, as a community give, for example, to teaching, to, let's say, building career prospect in the sense of intellectual career path, or vis-a-vis engagement with policy action, or vis-a-vis, let's say, concentrating into research. Clearly, this is individual. I mean, everyone has its own heterogeneity and its own, let's say, attitude. But in your opinion, where should be, let's say, the effort in keep on building the paradigm in the sense of the perspective that Chris has been developed and you have been, let's say, contributing and developing with the effort, particularly into the realm of macroeconomics and international political economy?
Well, again, I hope that some of the next contributions and comments will help us to think about that issue. What should we do? What can we do? I believe that we live in a paradoxical situation, Marika. On one hand, neoclassical economics is dying, is destroying. There's a civil war inside neoclassical economics. Lucas against Solow, Solow against Krugman. Read Blanchard criticizing the dynamic stochastic general equilibrium, which he used, which was so much important part of the use when he had an institutional role, and now he despises them. Look at John Taylor criticizing the non-orthodox monetary policy which the Federal Reserve and the ECB and the Bank of Japan for longer have been using in the last period, now perhaps closing it, but the monetarists themselves divided on should we let it burn, as Mello in 1929, Andrew Mellon suggested to President Herbert Hoover, let it burn. Which is the point of view of John Taylor, or others saying, no, perhaps Milton Friedman accepted that the monetary stimulus and liquidity could be added to the economy. So there's a fight, there's a confusion. The concept of equilibrium is an assassin, a theoretical assassin. It prevents from thinking, it prevents from understanding anything from reality. It is a mathematical mockery. But at the same time, on the other hand, evolutionary economics is not stronger than it was 20 years ago. Of course, there are strong networks, not only this CRIS network, which was created by our colleagues in India, and which has been so useful, but well, the Globalix, there are other networks going on. Well, the Santana Center of different activities, there are debates going on, there are associations live which go on, but the power of novelty of evolutionary economics, I believe it's not stronger now than it was when Chris was at the peak of his activity. And other people, of course, Sidney Winter, Richard Nelson, well, so many of other people. There's a natural tendency of people of over-specialization, and that may explain why the SPLU is so biased towards one of their strongest points from forever, but it was not a single one. And I miss some theoretical discussions and macroeconomic discussions which happened at the same time in SPLU, or even by Nick von Tunzelman on the history of economics, on the history of the industrial revolutions, on the history of the events, of the processes, of the inventors themselves. So we miss that. One of the means I have been suggesting is that we should concentrate some more efforts in teaching, not because that is not being done. There are very good centers with wonderful teachers of evolutionary economics, but because we should systematize. The news that Giovanni Dozzi is going to publish is finally, after so many years, his promised handbook for innovation economics. It's very important. I published a handbook on political economy, but in Portuguese and for the Portuguese audience, which is taught in different faculties in Portugal with a colleague. Because I believe that is really very important. Give we should share among ourselves the tools and the ability to teach and to multiply teaching, to create school, to put together some ideas and to challenge ourselves from that point of view. So having the Giovanni's handbook for the master or PhD courses, because it's an advanced handbook, is wonderful news. Others should do and could do the same. Marika, perhaps you and other people for undergraduates, because we should fight on that. If they only study microeconomics from absurd books such as Variance, which is a phantom, or macroeconomics from Krugman's or Stiglitz or Blanchard or whatever, they will, in the best of the cases, understand that there is something more just than the history of Robin Crusoe as the prototype of the economic agent. But that's not enough. So I believe that one of the most important tasks would be to fight for the space of learning, to teach and to come out for a little bit from our peculiar matters of interest, of scientific investigation, and to create some common ground for teaching and learning. I believe that would be a good fight like hell. That would be good advice for all of us.
So, Francisco, thank you so much for highlighting the many arenas of conflict and of fights that we have to embrace. And I think it's now time for a break, if I'm right, and we will reconvene in 5 minutes. Rajesh, correct me if I'm wrong. And we have the second part of this moment of discussion with Francisco.
Excellent, Marika. Excellent time management. Thank you so much. We go for a break. And during the break, we have an announcement. Our next event is on 13th July. It is on the National Innovation System of Iran. We have an Iranian panel with Reza Asadifad, Ibrahim Susanchi, Kamran Bagheri, and Professor Bente Lund-Wall. And the session will be coordinated and chaired by Mariam Nozari. So we will shortly start diffusing this event. Please register and try to participate.
We reconvene in 5 minutes, is it, Rajesh?
Yep.
Okay. So
please.
I will suspend for 5 minutes. Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Are we back? Yeah. So we are back. So we have three panelists here. Can I start with Mario? A brief intro to Mario. Mario Simoli is the deputy executive secretary of the Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean, and the co-chair of the Initiative for Policy Dialogue at Columbia University, New York. He's a PhD from Sussex. His research deals with development paths, economic growth, international trade, and industrial policy, technology development, and innovation. Mario, please.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure for me to be here. I want to announce that I'm not more in ECLAC, and I have left. Time to pension is arrived, and it's a pleasure to be here to see all of you. To come back to academics for me is a pleasure, honestly. And I think I want to recall what Francisco and Marika said before the question. I think I am really more optimistic about the influence of, if you want to call evolutionary, from Latin America, we call structuralist economies, because if you look at the world from the most for developing economies, from medium income economy like Latin America or others, you look and you have the idea that in reality, the practitioner of policy making in many of these economies, take the case of the United States, of Europe, they really, in this last period, they are applying more political quoted evolutionary economics. Think at the way most of these countries are thinking about industrial policy. There was for many years a bad war, and 1 year before in the New York Times, in the first page, was United States coming back from applying an important industrial policy. The Inflation Act in the United States, of the Green Deal in Europe, is more an experimental industrial policy where people decide that have to create capability, industry, and so on. Of course, it's not really the way that we think, but practitioners in reality are considering that the capabilities of creating an industry, a transformation, is a process more related to the reality. Is not if they are applying policy or not the classical policy. They think honestly that a transition from brown economy to the green economy is a process that take a long time, that you need creative capabilities, you need to create a subside, stimulus, change relative prices, creative capability for rentability, and so on and so on. They honestly are applying policy in the more effective. On the other side, if you look at what the economists write about that, is different. The debate is another one, but in reality, practitioners are more evolutionary people. I want that if you have the opportunity to read the Inflation Act in the United States, they said clearly you have to transform the economy completely. You have to create new sectors, but creating new sectors is a complex process, they said. And we need to create more capabilities in research, in industry, of market opening opportunities. Also, the recent war, a defense policy is part of these creation capabilities. And I think, honestly, they don't want to admit more mainstream economy, but they are more heterodox that we think about that. This is my first point, and I really the more optimistic. That is not happening in developing world, because developing world is more the debate mainstream economics, market equilibrium, be tough in adjustment policy, and so on and so on. And on the other part, the more structuralist, more state defense, and so on. So in that sense, I think the debate is relatively different. This is my first point. My second point is about what Francisco said in the question. I think there is an important contribution of Chris that for me in 20 years that I stay in Latin America and working in ECLAT was the importance that Chris give in the very militante world. Was very militant. And that's where is the importance of the industry in the very broad sense. Industry is not only a countable analytical unit, it's more than that. Industry, the place where from in his position from the labor, is the place in industry where you created jobs, you created capabilities, you created endogenous better distribution, and so on and so on. And for me, industry, and for the people that work in more developing economy, industry is becoming again an important issue. And I think that's contribution. I remember when I wrote Industrial Transformation, the book on the industry after the Second World War that Chris wrote on the importance of the chemistry industry, the industry that came out of the Second World War that supported basic industry and so on. And that was a book not only because industry is important, we had to study that, but because industry is very related to development. And development and industry is the combination that give also better distribution, better wages, better capability for the trade unions to create a better distribution and so on. That's, for me, is very important. In the last year, many times we forget the importance of industry and innovation, you know. And I think that is a crucial. If you read, of course, recently the two more important industrial policies that we can agree, we can say that it's not what I like, and so on. So, but the Inflation Act and the Green Deal, Inflation Act in the United States and the Green Deal in Europe, really are consistent industrial policy coming back on the importance of creating job, distribution, technology, and so on. And I think that contribution remains today live, and that's an important contribution. Conclusion of that, and I pass the word on this, is that many times this debate doesn't arrive in developing economies, you know, in the middle income economies. That debate is not the same. There is more, I want to say, more ideological in that sense. The debate on the other side, in reality, what's happened after this, I call these three crises: the financial crisis, the pandemic crisis, the recent crisis of the world, that are cumulative processes that discuss again the open economy, free economy, trade is good for everything, and so on and so on and so on. And I think that is an important contribution that many times we have to read. Concluding, today, if you look at the many developed economy today, that the global north, they want to create an innovation system on green, on the new Green Deal, and that is clearly that they want to do that. And they have the critical mass to do that. And I think for me, that is a very actual. On one side, I am not very pessimist for what's happening in the global north, but I really pessimist that this concept is not moving, is not adopted, is not debating in the global south. Thank you.
Well, wonderful, Mario. Thank you for your comments and contribution. Of course, it's quite difficult to argue with you, mostly with your experience and your subjectivity, pessimism and optimism. But you know quite well. I know not so well, but I certainly understand that there are ups and downs in the historical movement and the possibilities. When I was, well, many years ago, when Latin America, where you worked for the last decades at CEPAL, which was so decisive in the discussion and in some of the options which were applied in Latin America. But many years ago, I traveled there, and dictatorships prevailed almost everywhere. I met Lula just after he came out of jail. You know, he was imprisoned for the strike of the ABC, the metal workers of São Paulo, and then he was free, he was released, and then he created the Labour Party. And at that time, I met him. It was a time of immense hope. Well, the Portuguese democracy was very recent, the Spanish democracy even more recent, because Franco died after the Portuguese Revolution. But Latin American, it was not the case. There were dictatorships in Brazil, Uruguay, Argentina, Chile, Paraguay, and so on. But a new wind of freedom was coming, and indeed it came. But you see, well, many years later on, there was Bolsonaro, and so ups and downs exist in the history of in our lives. But I believe that in your most important point, you are right. There is a new wave of industrial policy in the making. I don't know as you do well enough the US case, but I'm pretty convinced you are right. Now, I have, and I understand that a green transition implies everything you said, and we could discuss it, and certainly we should, at the light of our common economic ground. Creation of capabilities, of learning, of new bases of knowledge, new professions, new forms of work, new organization of firms, new organization of markets, new definition of relative prices. All that should change, and it must. But I'm more skeptical about the parallel between the US and the European Union, because, well, the type of discussions in the European Union are much more, are even more difficult than in the US case. Although changes are possible. Well, I attended a meeting with Mario Draghi, and he was at the time president of the ECB, and he went around in Europe to convince governments that the ECB was doing what it should, loose monetary policy, but the governments were not, because they should expand the budget in order to create jobs, in order to develop investment. Well, and to see Mario Draghi trying to convince the European governments trained in austerity and budget limits to break those limits was a wonderful vision. So change may happen, but you see, in the European Union, there are many contradictory trends in the sense, well, look at air transport during COVID. The investment policy which was accepted and adopted was a policy for concentration in some major companies. The same exists for longer and with larger success in the banking industry. The European Union is concentrating banks at a very high speed with some choices from Santander to Deutsche Bank. Well, you know now the case in Switzerland, that's not European Union, but it goes in the same direction. Now, for industrial policies, which would be so required, the rules are very biased, because as states cannot have public financing of companies, it is only under exceptions or under general programs which are not so well defined. That would be the case of the green program, but for the states, for the governments, for the democratic space in each country itself, there is no sovereignty for public investment or directive action in the sense of industrial development. So I'm more skeptical about the possibility of having the scenario you paint in the case of the European Union. Now, would it be the case that the pressure of reality and of the needs will be so forcing that will change, as it did in some ways in the last years, for surprise of many? Maybe. And that we will see. But the tools are quite inadequate for that, mostly because there is no public opinion, European public opinion, which can express as such.
So, thanks, Mario, for that intervention and comments. Now, next, may I call upon Valeria Cirillo. Valeria is Associate Professor in Economics at the University of Paris Aldo Moro. Is that pronunciation correct?
Yes, it is. Bye.
Yeah, and Institute of Economics, Santana School of Advanced Studies. She works on labor market dynamics, technologies, occupations, and inequalities. Valeria, please.
Okay, thank you, Rashad, for the introduction, and I'm very glad to participate in this conversation. I warmly thank Marica, Francisco, Mario, Luigi for this kind invitation. I don't know if Francisco remember, but we met almost 10 years ago for the first time in person in Sant'Anna. It was November 2015. At the Institute of Economics, when Giovanni Dosi and colleagues had organized these 2-day meetings on Chris Freeman legacy. In fact, the title of the workshop was The Intellectual Legacy of Christopher Freeman, Some Contemporary Challenges for Economics, Innovation, and so on. And on that occasion, together with my colleague, Dario Guarascio, who is now at the Sapienza University, we interviewed you. we did an interview about the political crisis in Portugal. It was 2015, when the right-wing ruling party lost over more than 1 million of votes. And for the first time in over 40 years, there was a sort of political debate opening up between the Socialist Party, which despite the name, it is more traditional party conform to the European rules, and the left-wing parties, including both the communist and also the left-wing bloc, the Bloco de Esquerda. This is also to remark your political and militant activism in your experience. Of course, I share with Marika the idea that you are a full intellectual, and so. But I would like to highlight this aspect on your biography. These were years of austerity in Southern Europe, in Portugal, as well as in Italy. I remember Portugal had been particularly affected by austerity policies, cuts in public health, education, social services, leading to massive unemployment and increasing poverty rates. But I remember that I was actually, yes, I was rereading the interview, and during this interview highlighted the low intensity of social conflict and popular reaction at that time in Portugal, even though to the profound changes in social structure occurred as a consequence of the austerity regime imposed after 2008. So, I mean, I would like to ask you something related to that, because in my impression is that, well, from a theoretical point of view, I think in the evolutionary school and in the tradition of innovation studies, sometimes we have been quite silent with respect to distributional issues. It's true that we have always acknowledged the non-neutrality of technological change, highlighting the importance to investigate the asymmetric consequence of technological change on social classes. And also we applied obviously a non-deterministic lens to study the unfolding of innovation, so focusing what happens actually at the workplace. And in fact, this is very an important aspect that you also highlighted in your in your biography, in the sense that we really need to put together different disciplines such as sociological studies, but also historical type of analysis and so on. And I think this is very crucial when we would like to focus on inequalities. But on this, I share what you were saying before. Sometimes we were too much focused on micro type of analysis on inequality dynamic, losing the whole picture of what is going on. So the analysis of inequality in capitalism, that on the contrary, you really assess and investigate in your main book, but even in the critique of Piketty, as you said. In fact, reading your article, you really highlighted that we are in a time where inequality is now the new normal, in the sense that it is required a new social regime of accepted inequality, implying a deep change of the capital-labor relation, changes in labor contract, wages, industrial relation, and even changes in social rule, restricting the space of public goods and democracy. So from this point of view, quite pessimistic. So my point is, if this is our understanding of the dynamic now, and we also try to focus inequality in the accumulation regimes that we are living now, we are in a financialization phase, what we can do to revert this trend, if there is a space for social conflict, and also what is the role in terms of intellectual, in terms at least of, I mean, professor at university, how we should assess this type of issues, which kind of policy action we can put in place, which is our role in terms of economists and social scientists when we teach in our classes, what should we do, at least to be engaged in some form of social movement, or at least to renovate the debate on this.
Well, thank you, Valeria, for your comments. I indeed remembered we had met, but I didn't know exactly the date. Well, that November 2015, that would be shortly after the elections, which changed the right-wing government towards a socialist government with this written pact with the other left-wing parties, as you mentioned. And that was a surprising novelty in Portugal. I was not anymore in parliament at that time. I was just there for 5 consecutive elections, and I thought that after a certain time it is enough. There's a Republican principle of replacement of the elected people. I was not anymore there, but I followed quite closely. It was a difficult negotiation on what should be done, but it was a successful one. So there was, for 4 years until 2019, a government of hope, in the sense that it could be able to revert the mood and to change, even to compensate some of the losses in pensions and wages, to renationalize the air company and other public goods, and to try to preserve and to develop some of the important tools of the welfare system. But it was quite limited from the point of view of industrial investment, of investment in general, and for the expansion of a new policy. That is also because, as a small country, as others, Portugal is quite limited by the European rules. And because the traditional governments tend to be educated in a new mantra of markets prevailing in the definition of the investment or the economic choices. Now, what you mentioned about the changes in the labor market and inequality should be one of the most important points of our research. That was certainly the case for Chris Freeman and his work with Carlotta and Luke and other people. Although he was, that's my point of view, maybe some will not agree, but as he wrote until 2000 and the first years of the 21st century, he was quite open-minded as he should, but quite hopeful on the open possibilities that the new technological paradigm should provide for new forms of labor relations and new forms of social contract. I believe that that was a reality. It was an open choice, an open bifurcation. It still is. It is always possible to use technologies in different ways of social organization, certainly. But the tendency which prevailed from then was a closure of the social institutional system. In your works, you mentioned the platforms, the sort of labor contract which is represented by the platforms. And that's very interesting to study, because it begins at the margins of the distribution system of consumption goods. And then it becomes a little more central. In some countries, you have, in the city of São Paulo, you have 300,000 people distributing food or delivering goods. So it becomes very massive. And it is a field of experience of not only of a new form of contract, but a new concept of labor itself. Because these people, very poor people, working in the worst possible conditions, with no right for holidays, with no payment for social security, should consider and declare themselves as entrepreneurs, as private firms, personal firms, in order that the contractor will not pay for the social costs. Of course, well, some courts in different countries, United Kingdom and Spain, I don't know if in Italy, but at least in these cases, are challenging that situation. But you see, the experience and the pressure in both senses in order to define and redefine and change and rechange the concept itself of labor is a splendid representation of the type of conflict there is in the general scope of the social institutional system. Now, in order to study that, you ask, what should we do? Well, as students, as scientists, as economists, as social scientists, we should understand that and teach and provide and give the tools for studying and for understanding. And that means really combining different sciences. interviewing, psychology, behavioral economics, in microeconomics, even in management schools, new fields are being developed, which are wonderful and very promising on this sort of studies. And then, of course, there is the understanding of the economic mechanisms. And in that sense, I believe that rent extraction is a very important field, meaning understanding finance. We cannot understand the day-to-day life in modern capitalism unless understanding the role of rent extraction by finance, which is not only banking, not even only shadow banking, which is more important than banking itself, but it is the management of hospitals, the management of prisons, the management of highways, and other forms of rent seeking, which becomes so important. In some studies I published with some colleagues in Portugal and addressed to the Portuguese case, we wanted to study the history of capital in Portugal for the last 100 years, and then we wrote a trilogy on the social classes. Popular classes, what's called medium and average classes, I don't know exactly how to translate it, and then the bourgeoisie. And in order to do that, we studied a lot of different aspects. We studied the history of families, marriage, inheritance, changes in legislation, combination of the different dynasties of capital with the different social regimes. We studied where the children of the bourgeoisie study, which are the schools, what do they teach, what do they learn at church, at the mass, what is the prevailing, which are the prevailing ideas diffused by industrial literature, how is it arranged, the following of news at the major televisions, how is information spread, how is information organized. And I believe that this sort of combination of knowledge, that's what we should know and we should look at in order to understand very in detail what is the working of the economic system, and therefore where it can be changed and where social measures can be taken, meaning measures for equality, for investment, for the creation of production, for the energy transition, for the equality of gender, and for the different aspects which are so relevant for our policy. And in that sense, if Chris Freeman was the more optimistic of all of us, he provided a guideline of will, he wanted to address those issues. And I think that in that sense, we are deeply grateful to what he did and what he pressed us to not give up.
Thank you, Francisco.
Thanks, Valeria. Next to Luigi Marengo. Luigi is a professor of economics in the Department of Business and Management of Louis University in Rome, and formerly professor and dean of the School of Social Sciences at Sant'Anna Pisa. His main research interests are evolutionary economics, organization theory, complexity, and technological change. Luigi, please.
Thanks, Rajesh, and thank you very much, Francisco, for giving me this great opportunity to have a discussion with you, which, as usual, is very interesting, stimulating, and also nice. However, I would like, by the way, if you don't mind, I will change a little bit my question in relation to what I told you, but also because you discussed already quite a lot the links between your academic and your political activity, on which I wanted to point. And just for the sake of arguing a little bit, I will try to challenge, to bring some marginal little points of disagreement with you and with my great friend Mario as well, and to express a more pessimistic view and to see, maybe just because I'm getting old, but I'm not a pessimist at the end, but some concerns that I have retrospectively. But let me first start with a nice note. I got to SPRU for my PhD in '87, almost by chance. Really, I was accepted in Cambridge, but then Giovanni Dosi came to give a seminar in Torino where I graduated. I found it very interesting. I approached him and he told me, don't go to Cambridge. I will not tell you why. Of course, as you know, Giovanni can be extremely politically incorrect. Come to SPRU and work with me. And he convinced me in 10 minutes. And I gave up SPRU and I gave up Cambridge and I came to SPRU in almost immediately that evening. And arriving in '87, Mario was there. You were actually coming and going a little bit. It was the time in which Chris was mostly at Merit rather than SPRU. In fact, unfortunately, is one of my big regrets. I didn't interact so much with Chris because he was spending most of the time at Merit. But I had many chances to interact with him, with Kip Pavitt, with Mario, Gigi, and so it was a wonderful time, and I really never regretted I chose SPRU instead of Cambridge for the rest of my life. I think it was the best choice, or one of the best choices I made in my life. Nevertheless, I wonder sometime with this wonderful, extremely stimulating, this extremely powerful cultural movement which was going around SPRU, but also Yale. No, I put together the innovation, neo-Schumpeterian evolutionary thinking was successful and managed to produce what we expected to produce. And on this, I would be a little more pessimistic than Mario. No, Mario mentioned industrial policy, but at the end of the day, policies in general, industrial policies very often have been a domain let's say, in which a more pragmatic and easy use of theory. Most of the things that you mentioned, Mario, don't really need an evolutionary or Schumpeterian foundation. Many of these things are just good common sense of not too ideologically narrow politicians that can bring on board a little 1/3 of Keynes, 1/3 of Cimoli, some little drop of Nelson and Winter and so on, combine a cocktail of policies and justify them in some way. On the contrary, I think, and obviously I have a little bit of disagreement with you, Francisco. You mentioned before that, also referring to Chris, that where really we should attack the mainstream is macro. On the contrary, I think that macro is extremely important because at the end, policies are informed by macro. But being myself a microeconomist, and I spend all my life doing micro, I feel that micro is really where the strength of the theory is. And on this, the neoclassical paradigm No, in fact, even macro now, they try to make a micro-funded macro, sometimes doing things which are absolutely awful, disgusting, unbelievable. But really, that's the strength of the neoclassical paradigm. And it's not by chance that the first handbook of Giovanni, who wants to attack this, is a micro. And by the way, we had the first meeting about this handbook hosted by you, Francisco, in Lisbon a very, very long time ago. You certainly remember. And micro is really where the strength of the theory is. And is a very strong theory. Most of it is wrong, is, well, not even wrong, is irrelevant, is, and again, also the evolutionary economics was trying to attack mainly, if you take Nelson and Winter, was mainly to attack on the micro side, the theoretical construct of neoclassical economics. And on this, I wonder many years later if we did what we were supposed to deliver. And I have strong doubts on this, and I don't want to finish this beautiful conversation with pessimistic notes, but I would really like to know what your impression are on this idea. No, just to give you a little personal note again. I remember the first years of my PhD, I was very often going to conferences in which Nelson, Winter, Giovanni Dosi, sometimes even Herbert Simon was there. And there were also Kahneman, Tversky, Kammerer, the behavioral economist, all together in the bulk of heterodox, non-mainstream, pseudo-revolutionary strange economists. They were very successful. Maybe we were successful in and this, probably we have to recognize that this is the way economics works. They were successful because they could be embodied in the paradigms somehow. Changing the paradigm, accommodating the paradigm, but without revolutionizing the paradigm, without throwing the paradigm in the dustbin. Things that economics will never do, I'm afraid. It goes through little changes and by embodying new aspects, new theories, and it does it in a rather flexible way. No, capitalism, you say, is flexible, but also neoclassical economics is quite flexible. They are not totally narrow-minded idiots. On the contrary, they accommodate, they change quite easily, but they are changing in an adaptive way. This happened a little bit also with evolutionary ideas, no? Aghion, Philippe Aghion, who will probably get the Nobel Prize sooner or later, embodied some homeopathic doses of neo-Schumpeterian evolutionary, but only homeopathic ones, and very often without even quoting the sources. I would like to ask you: do you think this fight is over and somehow we lost it? We deserve, you especially, some medals and so on, but the fight is over and something else will happen, or you still see some opportunity. No, you mentioned, and then I really stop because I'm talking too much. Paradoxically, we are having higher impact outside economics. Now, you mentioned before management, and now I'm in a management school, and I publish more often in management journal than economic journal. If you go to the Academy of Management, which unfortunately happened to me a couple of times, Sid Winter is a kind of a semi-god Giovanni Dosi got an important prize, and he was given another prize in the European Academy 1 week ago. So they are really, they deserve the greatest consideration. And as you know, Sid Winter finished his career in a business school. And indeed, all this evolutionary sprue itself now is not an economics department, is in between, is partly merged with the business school. So in that domain, certainly the tradition had a huge impact. In economics, much less, and probably less and less so.
Well, thank you, Luigi. Beginning with the end, I think you are right on the impact of Sid Winter, other people in management schools, and I'm happy you are opening a space there as well. You have been doing that for quite some time, and I think it's good. It's a good idea. You see, the economics departments in so many faculties are dead trees. They just reproduce philosophical stance, and they do not intend to do more. When you open some of the major journals of economics, the most highly quoted and quoted journals, it's awful. Even if you make, I saw some research some time ago on how many of the mathematical models applied there had some empirical counterpart, and even that is very small. But that is coming for many years now. And so the fact that evolutionary economics could have a dialogue with different fields is what it has been built for. Evolutionary economics could not be other thing than a very diverse field of many provinces. If it would be highly successful, it would have neo-Schumpeterians, Marxians, Keynesians, some of the post-Keynesians, and then different people from sociology, history, management, geography, and other fields of social sciences. That sort of combination should be aimed by evolutionary economics. Now, we had some traps since the beginning. One was the biological metaphor. So restricting the concept of evolution to the original notion of evolutionary biology, Darwinism, was a problem, I think. First of all, because most economists used it, most evolutionary economists used the metaphor in an unfaithful way. Well, look at Nelson and Winter. They say that they are Lamarckians. So, if you want to translate the core concept from one science to the other, and then take a non-verified view of in that science, because Lamarck was wrong, it is a problem of coherence. Of course, a metaphor cannot be a strict discipline for a science itself. So it would be much better if we had not spent so much time explaining how Darwinian or Lamarckian was our economics, because it was neither, but to establish a concept of evolution, which would be the general dynamics of historical processes in social life and in social organizations, and that would be quite nice. From that point of view, the fact that in micro there are so many changes is good news. I think so. And even the fact you mentioned the conference in which some behavioral economists, which were attended by Kahneman and other behavioral economists, that was good. Of course, Kahneman lives in a contradictory world, because at the same time he writes against the Chicago school, the econs, right? The econs are absurd. The representation of human agency in economics as the econs, contrary to the human beings, is a choice to emphasize the absurdity of the micro foundations of neoclassical economics, but at the same time is methodological individualist, and he still rejects the core concepts we should use, which is interaction, coordination, institutions, and all the dynamics which is created by society as such. And that's where the novelties in microeconomics should combine with the understanding of macroeconomics. Of course, at the beginning, it was only one discipline. It is a very late choice to separate both. Why wouldn't Stuart Mill or Marx or other people, let's read the Capital, how many accounts of firms are quoted in the Capital, how many cases of trade, international trade are represented in the building of the knowledge which was represented by Marx. And I believe that the other classical economists from different and so contradictory points of view went in the same way. So I believe that this sort of combination is the natural way of expressing of economics, looking at different levels and different angles of understanding the reality. But in a sense, I think that the challenge of neoclassical economics, which is we have sound micro foundations of macroeconomics, is not only wrong, because they are not sound. They represent zero intelligent agents moving as particles. Well, you know the Irving Fisher PhD thesis, and he was not only the responsible for the introduction in neoclassical economics in the US, but also the first president of the Econometric Society when it was founded, when it was inaugurated in 1930. And in his PhD, he even published a map, a table of the translation of the concepts between physics and economics, and the agent was a particle, a zero intelligent particle. That was very well expressed as the micro foundations of macroeconomics. But in a sense, we have the opposed challenge. We should create the macroeconomic foundations of microeconomics, in the sense that all the studies of firms, contracts, institutions, relations, labor movements, and so on, should be placed in the framework of the real history of the society and of economic power and financial power and all the social conflict in general. So reintroducing the dimension of tension, of conflict, of choices, of strategies, of organizations, of that can be the core of our science. And in that sense, as pessimistic as we could be about the relationship of forces and all the bad signs, will Trump be again the president of the US? It can happen, right? As pessimistic as we can be on what we see in the world, there is a deep reason for optimism in the sense that the understanding of these tensions and the ability of acting on them for the common good, for the majority of the society, for the reduction of inequality. That's a program and an agenda which is not only scientifically motivated, but also socially common sense, or should be common sense, or should fight for being common sense, and therefore to gain the public opinion and to create some convergence between science and action in that sense. So it's not easy, but it was never easy, right? So that's how life is. So and let's leave it as we can. But anyway, many thanks for your challenging views. You challenge Mario. I don't know if you will reply as well. Well, there are different views and different approaches in the common ground we have, as Marika and Valeria expressed so well, and Rajesh, you know, that other people in the previous conference did as well, certainly, which is this immense curiosity we have for science and the will to have science looking at real life, at real economies, and to have a real economics on real economies.
So thank you, Luigi, and thanks, Francisco. Can we? Is that all? Any panelists would like to say anything more? Can we close the panel?
If I may just say words or comment, just to say two things. The first is about the influence of the paradigm inside economics, outside economics. I would like to share my take on this. If we think about the old direction in which many of the most prominent economists nowadays are going, so if you take the MIT scholars and I don't know, the Stanford scholars, and all the new emphasis on the role of technology, on the role of robotization, automation, and the impact on employment. And you read Chris Freeman's contribution 1982 and co-authors together with the with the other co-authors, Luc Sete and a third one. Sorry, I don't remember the name now, but you will help me. You see that actually there is a strong renewal attention on the role of technologies and its impact in terms of the social structure. So I think there is influence on that in what the mainstream is looking for. If you just look at the way in which all innovation economics has been normalized, all the use of patents, all the use of R&D concept, and even the, let's say, the analysis at the firm level, all the emphasis that now the mainstream is putting on heterogeneity and on, let's say, diversity of firms' behavior, this, I think, it's something where really it should be acknowledged as an inheritance of the evolutionary paradigm. And this is one point. The other point is about what should we take about the evolutionary, let's say, metaphor? Is about selection, is Lamarckian. I would say we should take structure. So we should take the notion of structure that are in the biological, let's say, manifestation. And this is something that structure, feedbacks, system level dynamics, and those are let's say, the way in which we may methodologically address question of capitalism. And this, I think, in this we are very much embraced by means of good tools. And finally, the last point, are we, let's say, I would like to, let's say, go beyond this pessimistic versus optimistic, let's say, right? Because this is not the way in which I do, I mean, it's fine, but we should go over. And I'm pretty sure that in terms of the new challenges that we currently are seeing, we are better embraced than the mainstream. The point is how much, let's say, consensus are we able to build in terms of what we are able to, let's say, develop and provide. And this is another aspect. And I think that we need to bring more, let's say, if you want, an established paradigm inside the discipline, but even outside, I think we should find good alliances. And one of the main points is why the many heterodox schools have been so, let's say, interested in cultivating their own in development without making bridges. I mean, I'm pretty sure that in the next year, challenges will be so strong that the mainstream is always doing, yes, okay, we should do like this, but then we find this new policy in action, like the Industrial Relations Act, that, if I may say, it's more a reaction to the China, let's say, competition vis-a-vis a new, let's say, industrial policy, let's say, stance. So I think that reality will push us toward finding, let's say, strategies. One point that I believe we should take is building, let's say, consensus. But building consensus means finding a way also of creating alliances inside the discipline, but even outside the discipline. And here I stop. Thank you. It's not actually, it's just a comment. I don't know if it was allowed by Rajesh. Sorry, he's very strict in terms of managing the whole thing. So I stop here.
Absolutely fine, Marika. Thank you very much. You conducted the session very efficiently, and we have not crossed the time very much. We can take another 15 minutes for the discussion. And I see Professor Bentuke's hand up. Please, Professor Bentuke.
Thanks first for a very interesting discussion. I think I'm afraid I will add another comment. And it's quite a lot in line with Maria's, but it relates to Mario's issue about industrial policy in the United States. I wonder if it's meaningful to make the distinction between micro and macro when we are talking about $350 billion which are pushed into the economy under the name of industrial policy. Second, I would say, of course, this is not called upon by macroeconomic theorizing. I think if macroeconomists had more power, we would probably not see this program. What I have argued in other papers is that both China and United States, they design their strategies on the basis of a theoretical understanding which is extremely close to Carlota Perez and Christopher Freeman. Both regard artificial intelligence and related technologies as crucial for world hegemony. And this is in line with change in techno-economic paradigm, the work by Chris on Japan, etc. And they are not really, and I think this also shows the limits of the power of mainstream macroeconomics and microeconomics for that sake. It shows that when critical things happen, I think Luigi Marengo called it common sense. The problem with this, you can see it as very positive because it shows the limit of standard economics, but at the same time, it could be the beginning of a military conflict and things like that. So, but anyhow, my point is that I think we see that economics is in certain situations as a discipline is in certain situations becoming irrelevant. Thank you.
if I may comment, Rajesh, just a couple of words on this recent topics by Marika and Bent Auke. There's a story, you may know it, it's quite... in 1936, Jan Tinbergen, who was at the time a young socialist in Holland, he was a physicist, a theoretical physicist, and he wrote his PhD on mathematical physics and on conceptual physics, with one of the brightest physicists of that time. But he was so interested in economics that he decided to move from physics to economics, saying that if I want to influence the fight for full employment, then I should be in economics. And indeed, that's what he chose to do. Now, in 1936, when he feared a war was being prepared or was possible, he tried to convince the recently created Econometric Society to write a manifesto saying that the economists would offer themselves and would be able to bridge among the different powers in order to propose a reasonable plan for the solution for the economic problems they had. And that would prevent war. Well, his older friends in the Econometric Society convinced him that was useless, and that the society itself was not created for that. But the question is not what we have today, but you see, so many of us think that if economics is to be useful, it is to look, to study, to understand the causes, the structures, as Marika said, and the contradictions and the possible solutions in the orders of investment, of accumulation, of the regime, of the labor markets and the labor dynamics and so on, which would create a better life, which would avoid conflicts such as war and others. So that's in that sense that economics is also useful as common knowledge for society. Of course, we are always fighting against powerful forces and powerful movements and random movements, and as well as very consistent ones. So, but I think that in that sense that economics is useful. And if some of these ideas permeate our other sciences and influence some capacity of decision, and if they can influence public opinion, I think that we are moving in the right direction.
Yeah, there was a comment from Beatrice. If Beatrice wants to make that point, please come forward.
She wrote,
okay.
Right?
Yep. Now,
thank
I
you,
have a
Rajesh.
Yep.
Thank you, Rajesh, for the opportunity. I was looking at the discussion on inequality, and I picked on issues of unpaid care work, which falls under the gender, the gender issues in society. And I was wondering whether there are any successes in the world or now unpaid care work has been incorporated into the economy as lessons learned for Africa. Africa is grappling with unpaid care work. Thank you. Over to you, Rajesh. Thank you.
Well, Rajesh, if I may...
No, Francisco, please respond. The question is to you.
Well, just a couple of words. Perhaps Valeria knows better than I do. The problem is certainly important for Africa, but for other regions of the planet as well. Everywhere there is unpaid care work, and it's a large part of the real economy and real life for many people. I know of some discussions on alternative ways to address care work, and in particular unpaid care work. Uruguay created for a couple of years ago a national service of care, which should be developed, but now I heard that it has been interrupted by a new government. But the idea was to develop in the sense of creating a national system which would pay and organize and support the work of care of people caring for others in different levels of activity in the society. In my own country, there is a discussion on how to pay, to help, or to have a partial pay on care workers, and a small, very small still proportion of those care workers are now inscribed in a national list, and they get some payment. And there is a discussion on what type of legal system would guarantee their status and their inclusion and recognition and help.
A quick question from my side. From a personal point of view, I have been curious how Francisco combined a scholarly life, a revolutionary life, and a political life. And what have been the advantages and disadvantages with respect to opportunity cost of such a modeled career? Did it give you opportunities to test your own hypothesis in practical realm, or did it distract you in your scholarly pursuit? And what sort of politicians do we need? Do we need scholarly politicians or scholars with political career?
Well, I don't know, Rajesh. I don't know if there's an answer for that question. We need real people addressing real problems and being Democrats and responsible for what they do, and being clear on what they do, being clear on the difficulties, and no demagogues and populists which endanger the human species. But in my own case, I did what I like to do. So, well, I'm still teaching. I have always been teaching, even when I was in Parliament. I went on with my duties at the faculty because I like it, because I enjoy it, because it's very helpful for teachers, as we all know, all the present know very well, to have the challenge of the students and to have to try to develop at the same time scientific research which is published and which is discussed. Of course, if I had not the same responsibilities, perhaps I would have published some more books in economics or more papers, but I don't care so much about that, really. The more difficult question is what can one do, or even one social current or political current do? And it is limited under the present circumstances. Anyway, I could in some cases be part of discussions and decisions on the budget, on taxes, helping to fight inequality, or transparency. I once presented a law which was approved which is a very simple question, by the way. It just stated that all firms which are in the stock market should publish a complete description of the wage payments the wages they pay. Meaning that while the firms in the balance and the accounts tend to publish just the total, the amount of spending in wages. And the law imposed that the administration, that each member of the board, we should know the payment in prizes and wages for each member of the board. At that time, one of the prominent bankers in Portugal said that if the parliament approves such a terrible law, there could be a revolt tomorrow. Well, indeed, it was approved. There was not such a revolt, although the motives were not were present. But we knew something more. There was a little more transparency on this sort of tools of inequality, which is secrecy, and which is non-transparency of payments and of prices. And well, so did it help quite a lot? No, not so much. But people can know now if they are paid a couple of euros, and if the price is in a firm which is firing people for restructuring, if they are paying millions to their board members. And that's a good argument when they will discuss at the table of negotiations for their rights. So you see, some small things may be important or not, some may become important, but well, that's what should be done. We should know and help people to know and to know how to know.
Thank you. Can we close the session now? Okay. Thank you, Francisco, for accepting our invitation, participating in this event, and particularly for writing a very interesting autobiographical note. We appreciate. Thank you very much. You have been with us right from our inception days. Thank you so much for that. Thanks, Marika, for the incisive interview and masterly conducting of the session. Thank you, Mario, Valeria, Luigi, for your questions and comments. I thank all the participants for a very attentive and disciplined participation. I also thank our team members who has been working behind the program silently with great dedication. Thank you very much, everyone. A good day, good evening, or good night. Thank you very much.
Bye. Thank you. Bye bye.
Bye. Thank you, Rajesh.
Bye.
Thank you.
Ciao, ciao.
Bye, grazie.
Bye bye,
Ciao.
everybody.
Bye
Bye, everyone.
bye. Bye bye.
Thank you so much.